Hello, my name is Chantal Stevens with Solar Washington. Whether you are watching live or watching a recording, welcome to today's webinar, the Homeowners Guide to Going Solar, Part 1, Should You Consider Solar? In this short 30-minute presentation, followed by a few additional minutes to answer questions, I hope we can help inform you about what to think about if you are considering the move to solar. First, let me say a few words about Solar Washington. We are an independent, nonprofit association for anyone interested in solar. We have been around for over 20 years, 24 years actually. We do our work through education and community involvement to promote the sustainable development and equitable use of solar energy and its contribution, its very positive contribution to the economic, environmental, and social fabric of Washington. Our vision is that of 100% clean energy Washington. Our work, though independent, is only possible because of the support of our sponsors and members, and we are very grateful for their support. This is the first webinar in a series of 5 webinars where we take you on a journey from wondering whether solar is right for you to thinking about what other improvements should be done once solar is installed. In our next webinar, we'll talk about where the rubber hits the road, solar financing and incentives. Make sure you are registered for that next session. We are incredibly lucky that one of our board members is someone with a remarkable knowledge of solar from her experience with many facets of the clean energy realm. Deborah Haffner-Ratliffe began a career working as a solar installer and was a founding member of WASEA. She then went to work for the state, including the Department of Labor and Industries, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Natural Resource, where she worked in all those areas on electrical contractors, low-income housing, solar, electrical vehicle, and energy efficiency. In addition to serving on the Solar Washington board, Deborah works in government affairs for a public utility district, and she runs a consulting company that helps people and organizations navigate solar. At the end of the webinar, we'll take questions, so you can enter your question at any time throughout the presentation, and we'll try to answer a few of them at the end. We are trying to make this as concise and quick as we can. We know your time is valuable. So we'll only answer a few questions and may answer more questions after the webinar. We'll also have a quick survey at the end for you to tell us what you think about this webinar. So now, Deborah, let me make you the presenter.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, one moment for logistics. All right, Chantal, can you confirm it's up for me?
Yes.
Yes. Great, thank you. Hi everyone, like Chantal said, my name is Deborah Haffner-Ratliffe. I am a volunteer board member with Solar Washington, and today is part 1 of a series of webinars for homeowners considering solar. And today we're going to talk about, should you consider solar? With this, I just want to note that we are specifically focusing on residential solar for owner-occupied. Some of this is going to be applicable if you're looking at commercial solar or multifamily or other situations, but in general, we're really focusing on that residential single-family solar. And we're also really focusing on solar in Washington, even though some of what we talk about will be applicable to other states. It's also only a half-hour webinar, so we're going to do what we can to cover the really key points, but if you've got specific questions or something that is a unique situation for your situation, feel free to contact us after and we're happy to talk to you. And we also just know we aren't going to be able to get into everything even over the course of the 5 webinars. So today we're going to talk about why are people considering solar? How does solar work in Washington state? And does solar make sense for you? And so with that, we'll talk about siting, financial considerations, timing. When would you consider solar? When's the right time to consider solar? And then we'll also talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering in the second webinar, part 2. So everyone tends to have their own reason for considering solar, but the primary become economic and environmental. So economic is a way to reduce your energy bill, to reduce your reliance on the overall grid, to put your money with your values. And then on the environmental side, you have reduced greenhouse gases, you have local energy generation, and it's a way to decentralize power plants so you don't end up with large infrastructure. You can now have more dispersed, smaller on existing houses and things like that. So this is just a slide with some examples of some of the reasons people consider solar. There's also some increase in legal requirements or policies that require solar. So new houses have to meet a certain level of energy code, and solar can count towards some of those points. And then there's also economic factors beyond you as the purchaser. There's actually solar panels made in Washington state and local installation companies. You can't outsource construction. They're also very low maintenance. Panels are typically recyclable. There's a lot of reasons people might consider this. But really what I've found is if it doesn't make sense financially, that's really the thing most people are looking for. So we'll go over the basics of that today. So starting with how does solar work in Washington state? So the other thing I should mention is we're really going to focus on grid-tied solar today. There is off-grid solar where you're never connected to a utility, you're completely reliant on solar and other self-generation sources. But in Washington state, it's more common to be interconnected to the utility and have solar. So that's what we're going to focus on. So this is a diagram of just a really basic solar installation and how it all operates. So on the left, assuming everyone's screen is the same, the blue square is representing the solar panel, which produces energy that goes into an inverter. Solar panels produce electricity in DC, and our houses operate on AC. So that inverter does a critical step to not just convert the electricity to match what your home uses, but to also make sure it's matching and compatible with the grid so that it doesn't cause fluctuations. That energy then goes into your home. If you're home, you use the power, turn on the TV, it draws from the solar. And if you're not home, like it's a sunny day and you're at work maybe, that electricity goes back to the grid through a net meter, which we'll talk about more later. Things to note with this is unless you have a battery, your power still goes out. You still lose power during an outage. A battery system can interconnect to allow for there to be some emergency backup power during an outage, but that does have a limited duration. If you drain the batteries, you don't have any power left. Just want to make sure that people know the thing with batteries is they add a substantial cost, and so in most cases, batteries typically don't make sense, but there are situations where people decide that that's what's right for them. So solar panels come in a bunch of different types. There are, it gets pretty technical depending on what level of interest you have with them. There's monocrystalline, there's polycrystalline if you really get into the details of the cell structure, but there's also a traditional panel that you would see on a roof with the frame and the blue or the black. There's also thin film panels, the kind that are a little bit floppy that you might see on backpacking equipment or things like that. And now there's more and more solar roof tiles where the solar panels themselves are the roofing material. There's pros and cons to all of them. Typically, the traditional square solar panels are going to be the least cost and the most efficient. So you get the most bang for your buck. But if you're looking at new construction or you need a new roof anyway, something like a solar shingle might also be an option for you. The thing with that is also that a traditional panel is higher in recyclability. It's primarily made of aluminum and glass and silicone. So it can be recycled. Washington State actually now has a solar panel recycling law that is in process of being implemented. Whereas other panels, thin film, shingle, things like that, have a higher concentration of materials that have to be handled like toxic waste. So that might be a consideration for some people. Solar panels are also manufactured in terms of wattage, so how much energy it's capable of producing. We'll talk about this more later, but you could have two 500-watt panels or three 250-watt panels. Some people assume that 3 panels are better than 2 panels, but really that wattage is what measures how much energy you're going to get from that solar. The other thing is retail value. There is an option to do self-installs in Washington State if you don't want to work with a contractor. You can always go to electrical company, Platt Electric, for example. You can just go on their website and look up the different types of panels and wattage and what the retail value is. That can come in handy when you're looking at things like insurance coverage, or if you need to sell your home and you're trying to value the solar. It can be good to know kind of what's the retail value of these panels outside of the installation process. Solar panels also have 2 different warranties on them. One is the product warranty, what we typically think of when we think of warranties, if it stops working, if it malfunctions, if there's an error in the manufacturing. And those are typically 10-year warranties. And then there's also a production warranty. And what the production warranty does is it takes that initial wattage rating and it says this panel is still going to produce a certain percentage after so many years. So a pretty standard production warranty is that a panel will still produce at 80 to 90% of what it was originally manufactured for 20 to 30 years. And that's not to say those panels just stop working at that point. What'll happen is they'll just degrade over time. And so then it becomes a matter of personal preference or economics potentially of when you want to actually replace or upgrade the panels. But there's panels that have been operating for 50 plus years. The question just becomes how efficient are they at that point? And then, like I mentioned earlier, at end of life, solar panels can be recycled. There's also lots of opportunities for secondhand or reused solar panels, low income, impoverished countries. There's more and more of a drive to basically take those last remaining years of life for those solar panels and try and keep them out of that recycling or waste stream just a little bit longer. In some cases, you can actually find companies that will come and remove the panels for you and then repurpose them or find another use for them. Another major component is the inverter. There are different types of inverters. There are a traditional centralized inverter where all of the solar panels connect to the same inverter. There are also micro inverters where in some cases each solar panel has its own inverter or a couple of solar panels share an inverter. Again, pros and cons. And then the other thing is if you want battery, there are specific types of inverters that are required to operate with a battery system. You can't just take a traditional inverter and install it with batteries. So if you're thinking that you might want to do batteries in the future, it's something to take into consideration at the time. Retail value of these inverters really ranges, micro inverters to battery backup inverters. It's another one where you can actually go online and look them up. But you can find inverters anywhere from a couple of $1,000s each to $10,000 each, depending on exactly what you're looking for. And their warranty and life expectancy on a residential install is typically about 10 to 15 years. So it's something that folks are often surprised by, that they're under the impression that their system is warranted for the full production warranty of the solar panels. And that's not necessarily the case. So that inverter might need to get replaced halfway through the warranty lifespan of the solar panels. But it's a fraction of the cost at that point because the infrastructure, the wiring, all of those things are already in place. And inverters are essentially a lot like any other electronic. So depending on where you live, you might have different recycling programs available. You might be able to strip it down. You might have a recycler that just wants to take the whole thing. Or it might end up in the landfill. It just depends on the inverter, the components, and what's available. Batteries, again, are optional. If you don't have batteries, you will lose power. If you do have batteries and the power goes out, it'll switch. There are all kinds of batteries that can be used with solar, from lead acid, just like we use in our cars, to the fancier new Tesla Powerwalls. They all have significantly different value. It can be challenging if you're not familiar with battery backup to know what the options are and the right sizing and scaling. So there are many solar installers that simply just don't offer battery backup as an option. But then there are others who can specialize in that, or sometimes even do off-grid. The warranty on batteries can really vary. It depends on all kinds of factors. Typically, you'll see a warranty that's similar to a solar panel, where it's both the manufacturer warranty, the traditional "we made this properly" warranty, and the "it will perform at a certain point" warranty. Just depends on the manufacturer and what they're looking at. And life expectancy with batteries can really vary based on use. So some batteries prefer to be fully charged. Other batteries prefer to only be charged a percentage of the way. So those are ones where you really need to understand what is your battery designed for, what's the operation of it. And then at end of life, similar to everything else, there's a few options. Some batteries, like lead acid batteries, can be recycled and reused. Other batteries are a little bit more of a challenge to dispose of. And this is my very fancy graphic for a meter. So there are different types of meters. Almost everybody in the state is going to have a meter from their utility that keeps track of the electricity you buy. When you get solar, your meter now starts keeping track of all of the extra electricity your system produces as well. So it's called a bidirectional meter. And then there's production meters, which not every utility requires. Some do. Sometimes you might just want one so you can keep track of the production data yourself. And that meter keeps track of everything the solar produces, whether you use it or whether it goes back out to the utility. So on some solar installs, you'll see that there are two meters installed. One's the bidirectional meter and one's the production meter. And for a while, every solar install in Washington state had two meters because there was a program where there was an incentive for the production, not just what was sold back. But that program is no longer available, and I'm very sorry about my office lights. So check with your utility. Your installer should know what's required for that. Warranties, life expectancy, end of life are usually not an issue. Most utilities will upgrade their meters at a certain point. New technology, ability to read remotely, and the retail value can also depend. So if you're getting a production meter, some utilities will just include that as part of the fee for applying to interconnect with solar. If you want to do one on your own and your utility doesn't require it, you might end up spending a few $100s on that specific meter. It just depends on the policies with your utility mostly. So with this little diagram, these are all of our components and how they relate to each other. And when you look at our next presentation, we're going to talk more about the incentives associated with solar, and the meter is a big part of that, how the electricity is kept track of. So how does solar work in Washington? Not just logistically, but it rains a lot in Western Washington, as we know. So solar is proportional when it comes to production. So this is a map from the National Renewable Energy Lab that shows the potential solar across the United States. And what you'll see is, yes, the Southwest definitely has an advantage, but the northern part of the US is all pretty on the same scale with lower potential output. So as examples, for each kilowatt of solar installed, so earlier I said panels come in watts, a kilowatt is 1,000 watts. So basically, it doesn't matter how many panels you have installed, it's that energy size that matters. How much energy will that solar produce? And that's going to be measured in kilowatt hours. And that's the same way that you purchase your electricity from the utility, is in kilowatt hours. So if you're in Seattle, for example, for every kilowatt of solar you're going to have installed, you're going to get about 1,100 kilowatt hours a year of electricity. In Yakima, it's closer to 1,400 kilowatt hours a year of electricity. And so where you are, you can have the exact same solar installed in San Diego and it's going to produce differently based on where you're geographically located. And that has to do with things like weather patterns. It has to do with latitude. We have longer summer days because we're farther north, but we have shorter winter days and less sunlight during the winter. So knowing what the standard, the basic energy production potential for your area is will also help you evaluate whether or not solar is something that makes sense for you. And Chantal is going to put in the chat a link for PV Watts, which is a National Renewable Energy Lab NREL website where you can plug in your address and see what's expected for solar production in your area if you want to look at it yourself. So this is just some kind of the basic information to help identify if solar might make sense for you or if it doesn't. And one of the things we'll cover today is what if solar doesn't make sense for you? What are your other options? So a standard solar installation is on a roof. I think by now most people have seen a solar installation. You can see that it's flush mounted to the roof, so it's at the same angle. And these are traditional square panels, and you can see that they had to do a little bit of maneuvering to get around some of the existing vents and things like that on the roof. So with a roof, this is one of the more, like I said, more common solar installations. And the big question that comes up a lot is, what about my roof warranty? So roofs already take into consideration that they might have a vent or that you might get a skylight. There's typically rules within the warranties for roofs that allow for a certain level of changes in penetration. Now, that doesn't mean that the roofer will warranty where the solar is tied into the roof. There could be an issue with how the installer did it. Some installers will actually work with a roofer to get the solar installation where it ties to the roof to have that included in the roof warranty itself. So if there is an issue with like a leak after the solar installation, that's typically the responsibility of the solar installer, but it doesn't necessarily void the entire roof's warranty if they did it properly. The other thing is if you need a new roof while you have solar, what you'll have to do is you'll have to have the solar taken down and reinstalled. So that is a cost. It varies based on the installer, location, complexity of the roof, things like that. But it is an expense to take into consideration. But it is not nearly as expensive as the initial install because everything else is already in place. The permits have already been pulled. It's literally just removing the solar panels so that the roofers can get up and work. So on slide, yes, okay, perfect. Sorry, referencing my notes. So direction matters in the same way that where your solar is installed in terms of, in this case, Olympia, Spokane, Yakima, what direction the panels face also matters. So using the same measurement of kilowatt hours per year of electricity generated per kilowatt of solar installed, you can see that south facing is going to be the best place for solar. That's just facing the equator. That's where we get the most sunlight through the day. And then east and west are interesting because in some areas, east is better. You might get clearer mornings, but if you're somewhere like Olympia, there tends to be marine fog that rolls in. So afternoon is actually better. And then north is something that a good solar installer will probably never suggest and never recommend unless you are really wanting to maximize how many solar panels are on your roof. But north-facing panels just do not produce the same amount of energy as south-facing panels. They don't get nearly the same amount of sun exposure throughout the day. And when you have solar panels on a roof that face different directions, like let's say you've got a east and south facing roof where you want to put solar panels, depending on how they are wired and depending on what inverter they use, that system might only ever produce as much as the east part of the system will produce. We'll go into that in more detail in a minute, but just something to be aware of is that if you're getting a solar installation, make sure you understand how the different directions impact what percentage of energy you're getting produced from the system overall, and how the installer is taking that into consideration. So shading is a really common thing that comes up, whether you have a tree or a neighbor's house. And the thing with this is, like I was saying on the previous slide, if you have panels that are facing two different directions, what happens is solar panels are typically wired in series. So that means that the whole series will only produce as much energy as the lowest producing solar panel. So if you have 2 or 3 solar panels that faced east and they're on the same wiring as the panels that face south, they'll bring that whole south facing solar down with it. And it's the same logic for trees. So if you have a solar panel that has some chimney shade or a tree that's shading it, and you think, oh, it's fine, it's just one solar panel, it can actually really impact the overall production of the system and really limit it. There are some workarounds. By having a microinverter, you can have the solar directly inverted at each panel potentially, which will help decrease the impact of that shade. There are also things like optimizers that might be available as an option that'll help reduce that. But it's something to be aware of. If you have one panel and you think it's not a big deal, it might actually be. The other thing with trees is you've got to worry about things like branches and debris. So if you have leaves or pine needles that are going to fall and build up on the solar panels, that buildup will also block their ability to produce energy. Depending on the layout, you could have those materials getting stuck under the solar panels and impacting your roof. So I know someone who just goes in with a leaf blower a couple times a year and clears out all the leaves under the solar panels. And then branches. So homeowners insurance, making sure that it covers your solar is an important thing to do as well, because if you have something like a really big branch hit a solar panel just right, it can break it, it can shatter the glass, which will impact it. And that's typically not covered by the solar panel warranty. But solar panels are more difficult to break than most people realize. You can kick them, you can walk on them, not recommended. Please don't actually do that. But the glass is typically tempered glass, so they can take quite a bit of impact. And then just really quickly, here's some examples about what the installations on roofs look like. So this is a type of flashing. On the right is one that's got a curve to accommodate the tile shape, and it just slips right under your roof and connects in. And so it adds to the shingle pattern of the roof. And there's sometimes caulking or different materials underneath, or rubber. It just depends on the manufacturer and what they have. But the idea is it just integrates into the roof. On metal roofs, it's a little bit different. You can actually connect solar to a standing seam metal roof with just a clip. That's what's on the left. It doesn't actually penetrate the roof. You screw it on tight enough that it's holding the solar panel. And so if you're worried about a roof penetration, a metal roof like that might be a way to do it. And then on the right is another example of just how do you connect to a roof that has a texture to it. And so this is a screwed in metal roof connector. And then flat roofs typically come up more on commercial projects, but every now and then there's a roof that's flat on a home as well. And what is typically used there for an installation is called a ballasted system. And so what this image shows is, in this case, concrete blocks that are adding weight to the frame of the solar panel. And what that allows you to do is minimize how many penetrations you have to make into that roof. So you might have a quarter of the amount of penetrations, and that weight is relied on to help hold everything in place. The trick with this becomes, does your roof have the structural integrity to withstand that level of weight? And that's in addition to just the normal solar panel weight. If you don't want to put solar on your building, you can also do a ground mount installation. This is an example of one where it's just a pole with the solar panels mounted on top of it. You can also do them as more of like an awning style. But if you don't want to do it on your roof, you do have other options, and they are typically a little bit more expensive. but it can help move solar panels away from trees. It can help if you're nervous about putting them on your roof. It's just another option out there. And sometimes you can get automatic trackers that'll adjust the solar panels to follow the sun. And sometimes I've seen people have manual trackers where just in the morning, evening, afternoon, they go out and they click the solar panels a little bit farther in the right direction. Just depends on how much time and energy you want to spend on it. And, there are options for getting creative with how you do solar panels. This is a chicken coop where the best site on the property for this customer, this homeowner, was where their existing chicken coop was. And so the solar installer said, what if you rebuild the chicken coop and just use the solar panels as the roof material? So there's ways to get creative. You can do them as carports. You can do them as awnings on decks. Just think about what works for you. Other things to consider are, what is the current status of your existing electrical? Do you need an electrical upgrade? What's the structural integrity of your building, and what's the lifespan left on your roof? Solar panels don't add that much weight unless you're doing something like a ballasted system. They're typically within the snow load requirements for most buildings in the Pacific Northwest, just a couple of pounds per square foot. So normally it's not an issue, but if you have a building that could easily not support the weight, older, issues structurally, that's something to take into consideration. The other thing to take into consideration is the complexity of your roof. So if you have a lot of little pieces of roof like this house has, that can make things more challenging, because now you've got to have more wire and a little bit more creativity with the layout of the solar panels. And then also the steepness of the roof. Those can be harder to work on. They can require a little bit different infrastructure in terms of allowing the employees to safely work on your roof. So if you've got a really steep or really complicated roof, it's not to say don't go solar. It's just, something to take into consideration when you're considering it. So does solar make sense for you financially? We're going to go through this pretty quick. You can always come back and watch the recording if you'd like to go through it again. So your annual energy use divided by your solar production factor is how you would calculate what system size you would need to completely offset your home's energy use for a year. And there is no rule that says you have to offset your entire home's use. You could decide you want to do 10% of it. You could decide that you have a fixed budget you want to stick to. You could decide that you don't have the roof space to fully power your home. But this is just an example of how you would calculate it. And this is going back to a previous slide where I showed different areas of the state and how much solar you could produce per year. This is saying if you have a home where you use about 10,000 kilowatt hours a year of electricity, and you're in an area where a 1 kilowatt solar installation would produce about 1,200 kilowatt hours a year, you'd be looking at about an 8.3 kilowatt system. And again, that doesn't matter how many panels. Panels come in different wattages. You could have more, you could have less. But if you wanted to completely offset your bill, that's a place to start. It also doesn't take unique shading into consideration, and it also doesn't take orientation into consideration. That's just the flat, this is what it would produce in that area. And then the other thing is, how much would it cost? So before you even talk to a solar installer, you can get an idea of what you would expect to pay for solar. And so the best way to calculate that is to take how much solar you would want or need. So we're going to use the previous example, 8.33 kilowatts. And you convert that to watts by multiplying it by 1,000. And then in Washington State, the average price per watt that we've seen is about $2.86 per watt. And so by multiplying that out, you can see that an 8.33 kilowatt solar installation would cost just under $24,000. And again, there's variables. If your roof is steeper, it might be more expensive. There's a bunch of things that can factor into it, but we want to help share kind of a ballpark so you know what to expect. And then we'll get into this more during the next presentation, but there is a federal tax credit available And so if you qualify for that, you will have 30% of the cost of the solar applied to your tax liability. So you could hypothetically, in this case, save over $7,000 through that tax credit, reducing the overall cost of your solar installation. And so does solar make sense for you financially? The things you'll want to look at are, do you have sufficient tax liability? Do you owe enough in taxes that tax credit is something you can take advantage of? And does your project qualify for the tax credit? That's something that we're going to go over more in part 2 of our series on Friday. And then net metering energy savings. The more expensive your electricity, the more valuable that energy from the solar is. And so if you're in an area where you have really inexpensive electricity, you're not going to save as much with solar because that electricity doesn't have the same value. So knowing what your electric rates are is really important. And then the other thing is, does your utility have any other credits or financing available? Some utilities do. Some utilities have rebate programs and things like that. So it's just important to ask and know what is available in your area. And then the other factor to help calculate if solar actually makes sense for you is how much energy will your solar produce? Where are you located? Are you in an area with a lot of shade? Questions like that. So really quickly, trying to watch the clock here. So to do the financial calculation for energy savings, how to calculate how much energy you're going to save, let's just use Seattle as an example. If you're in Seattle and you're going to get about, let's say, 1,100 kilowatt hours per year of solar electricity per kilowatt installed, the retail rate of electricity in Seattle is just under 14 cents a kilowatt hour. That means you'll save about $150 a year per kilowatt of solar installed. And in the different areas, that math changes. So somewhere like Longview or Moses Lake, the energy prices are really, really low. And even though in Moses Lake you have a higher solar production factor, you're still not going to be saving as much money per year because the energy rates are so low. And then you have somewhere like Spokane where you have a electricity rate that's at the higher price and you have a better ability to produce solar. You end up saving almost $160 per kilowatt of solar installed. So again, go back and watch the recording to look at this in more detail, but the general idea is how much energy your solar system produces multiplied by the retail rate of your electricity is how much you can save per year. And if solar doesn't make sense for you, there are other options available. You can enroll in green power programs where you just pay a fee to have guaranteed green power provided to your home. Most utilities in Washington state offer this. And then there's also community solar projects where if you don't want to have solar installed on your own home, if you're a renter, if you don't have a good site, you can actually buy into a different solar project. Sometimes they're on schools, sometimes they're standalone, but there are other options to support solar if doing it for your own home isn't right for you. So when to go solar, you're going to want to take into consideration all of the end dates of the various programs and which ones you want to be able to take advantage of. We'll talk about that more in the next webinar. Roof lifespan, if you have a home when your roof's going to need to be replaced sooner rather than later, you're probably going to want to replace the roof first. Most installers use 10 years. If you don't have 10 years left in your roof, you should probably redo your roof before you go solar. The other thing is time in your home. If you haven't lived in your home for a year, you might not know how much energy you're actually going to use on an annual basis. And then the other thing is, how long are you going to live in the home? Are you going to be there long enough that you feel that it's a good investment to install solar on your home? And then other energy projects, which we'll talk about in part 5 of this series. Solar is going to produce what solar produces. If you really want to reduce how much solar you need to install, one of the things you can do is reduce how much energy your home needs. So you could do new windows, you could do insulation, and sometimes people decide they want to do that before they go solar so that they can do a smaller solar installation. Other times you install solar and you're really motivated to try and get that utility bill as low as it can go. So just think about kind of where your priorities are in terms of energy projects overall. Homeowners associations in Washington state are not allowed to say you can't install solar. That's something that actually comes up a lot. So if you have a homeowners association and they want to talk to you or they have concerns, you can reference this RCW 6438055, which talks about the rules that homeowners associations can have related to solar. They're mostly cosmetic, having to do with matching the roof color and things like that. So what's next? If you decide you're interested in solar, some of the things you should consider are how much electricity do you use? What's the cost of your electricity? What is your utilities net metering status? So we'll talk more about what net metering is in the next presentation, but that's essentially how you get your utility credit. Are there additional costs from your utility? You know, what are the fees from the utility to interconnect a solar installation? Every utility is different. Most installers include that in their estimates, but it might be good to know. And does your utility offer any additional funding or assistance? And some utilities have preferred installation companies. So if you're looking for an installer that has experience in your area and has worked with your utility before, that's one way to find out who they are. And then the other things that we'll cover in part 2 are how does the 30% federal tax credit work? You know, what qualifies for that? And if you're thinking about going solar and you see those no cost solar ads or free solar ads, we'll talk a little bit about what those mean and what the financing options are for solar as well. So thank you all for attending. Sorry, I went a little bit over on time, and Chantal, I will pass it back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Deborah. That was, yes, you did run over, but it was well worth it. Thank you for doing that. I have one question that was asked early that you may have partially covered is if I have, well, how do I need to change my existing electrical panel if I have to go, if I go solar?
It is not required. So if you have an out of date panel or it's already not up to code or something like that, you might want to or need to do that before you go solar. But most houses, especially most modern houses, have electrical panels that can be tied into directly. And if it is something that you need to do as part of the solar, it doesn't hurt to get a quote from an electrician that isn't a solar installer, just for comparison. And we'll talk about this more in the next presentation, but it might qualify for some of the incentives available if it's something that's required to install the solar.
Thank you. Yes, so as the little sign says here that you can send any questions that you have to info@solarwashington.org, and we'll attempt to answer any additional questions. Also, make sure you register for the next webinars because most of the questions that you have at this point will probably be answered at some point. We did run over a little bit in terms of time, so I had one quick question to ask, and it's a confirmation of what you said a little earlier about so anything that impacts one panel will impact all of the panels. Can you confirm that I understood this well?
It is not a definite. It depends on how things are wired. So if all of the solar panels are on the same wire, one solar panel will impact the others. If you have things separated, so if you have microinverters or you have two different strings of solar panels wired separately, then it spaces that out. But it is something where you do have to be careful because one solar panel can impact the others pretty significantly.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
There's some background noise there for some reason. Yeah, so we will see you on Friday for the next webinar. Please contact us if you have any questions. Again, there will be a quick survey at the end of this webinar when you close it. And also in 24 hours, you will be receiving a link to a recording of this session. So again, thank you very much. We really appreciate the time you took to spend with us today. and mostly thank you to our incredible presenter today, Dever. So have a fantastic rest of the week, and we'll see you on Friday. Bye bye.